So let's start with entity classes and objects. Okay, from the name entity, that means we use it for saving the data, the information. The entity here, it's the information that need to be saved or stored in the system. So what's the entity object? The entity object store the information. Entity object an instance of entity class. So as the figure here show, the entity object, here entity class, and here is the entity object. So the entity object is instance of the entity class. The entity object store the data and provide the access to the data in the system. In some case, the entity object may need to access other entities. So that's we have a relation between the entities or the association between the entities. So here an example of the entities we have a class. The class is account, so we create an object from this class which account and account. This is object from this class. Also, if we give another example, it's related to our subject, which is autonomous system. An example is the sensor monitoring example. It's also data class, and this class is store the information about the sensors. The attributes of the sensor is the name, the sensor value, the upper limited and lower limited. So also if you save the information of the sensor, so this is entity also. So we move to another type or another second classes is the boundary classes. Okay. Boundary classes or objects. As we mentioned, the boundary classes or the object is a software that interface to or communicate with the external environment. So the boundary classes used to model the interaction between the system and its surrounding environments. In the boundary classes, we need the boundary classes when the system send or receive the data from the environments. So the boundary classes is part of the system that depends on its environments. The boundary objects are further categorized into three objects: the user interaction object, proxy object, and input-output device boundary objects. So we start with user interaction object. The user interaction object from the name, the user interaction object is used to represent the human in the system. So the system deal with user, so we should to represent this human in our system. So we create user interaction object to represent this user. So in using the user interaction object, we should to write its stereotypes. So in each object we have to add its stereotype. If we use the user interaction, so we use these stereotypes. If we use the input output, so we use also the input output stereotypes. So the example of user interaction objects, it's the operators. So the operators here used to is a human and communicate with the system. So the operator in our example here, we call it here operator interaction, and here this is the class of the operator, and here the object of the class. So the operators used to interact with sensor data deposit to request the data or also send the data. The second boundary object is proxy object. Okay, so what's the proxy? Proxy also object interface. It's a software object that interface and communicate with the external system. An example of a proxy, if pick and place robot, its external system, and this external system, it's interact with our system or communicate with our system. So we should to create a software object, and this software object, it's proxy object, and this used to represent this external system. So in this example, the pick and place report object sent the command to the real world system, and the real world system report response to the proxy object. The third one is device, or we can say is input output device. This object is deal with input and the output device. So if our system is dealing with any physical device, we should to create an interface or object in our system to represent this device. So the input output object provide the software interface to the hardware input output software. So each input and output device that interact or communicate with our system should have corresponding interface or corresponding object in our system. An example of this is related to our subject. If we have uh, vehicles, we can say is the automated vehicles. So the automated vehicle, it's have arms, have motors. So this considered as input output device. So such devices should be represent in the system objects by creating input output device object. Okay, so the device input output device also can be categorized into input object, output object, and input and output object. So from the name input, it's used for input the data or input to the system, while the output is out some command or even to the environments, and input and output it will be for both. So let's see an example for each object. So the first is the input device. Okay, the input device is used to receive the input from the external input, from the external device. An example is the sensor. Here we have the sensor. The sensor is software object, while here is the hardware, is the real world object. So this real world object we should create a corresponding object to represent this real world sensor into our system. Here in this system, or in this example, the interface or the sensor here, the object sensor, the software object, receive the temperature from the external world hardware object. Here this is an example of input object. The output used to send out to external device. So an example of output object is read light interface object. So here the read light object is used to send on or off command to the external device. The third input output device or input output objects, it's the input and outputs. So this object is sent and received to external device. So an example of input output device, it's the card reader. The card reader is used to send used to read the information, also send some information. So the card reader read the information from the card, also sent a command to the to the device, such as eject. So the eject the card. So this is the sent some command to the reader.